So, what did you hear? What did you imagine? What did you experience? We've heard this story before. Jesus heals the man born blind. Did you notice anything new? Was there anything that surprised you? If we had the time to sit and chew on this a bit, what questions would you have? What would you wonder about? Did you identify with the man born blind? Or did you relate to the neighbors and his parents? Maybe the questions the Pharisees asked aren't too different from your own. I invite you to make a mental note of these things, or even perhaps put them into the comments here on Facebook now. Then pull out the story in the next few days. Read it aloud again. If you have enough voices in your household, share the different parts. And take some time with those questions. Share some conversation in your household about them. And then come back to the post and share what you came up with. Now, if I were to answer my own questions that I just asked you, I would have a lot of things on my list. I notice how Jesus just kind of slips out of the scene. He tells the man to go wash, but then he doesn't return until the very end when he seeks the man out once he's been kicked out of the synagogue. And then that makes me realize that, well, until Jesus comes to him later, the man never saw Jesus, never saw the one who restored his sight. But he testified about him again and again, never wavering in his witness. And I also can't help but notice that there is a note of comedy in the way that this whole story plays out. The back and forth of the questioning, the added witnesses that don't seem to be able to come to any sort of conclusion. But the main eyewitness, the eyewitness who never saw Jesus, has the whole story straight. The man born blind's response shows his frustration in a humorous way that helps us, if we listen, to understand that everyone is missing the point. With all these interesting bits and pieces of the story to get caught up in, well, it's also easy to get lost in the details. The story could perhaps be like searching for the latest updates on COVID-19. We could look up the thing we want to know and then start clicking on all the endless links, ultimately traveling further and further down different rabbit holes away from that last thing that we were looking for to be the main thing that we were looking for to begin with. In the end, we will have read more about a lot of things related to our search, some helpful and some probably not so helpful. But ultimately, we'll lose touch with what we were originally seeking to find. In a way, our story illustrates that. In their efforts to understand what has just happened among them, the community around the man born blind starts following the trail of information. Though the man's story was the same, they kept chasing additional details and they lost sight of what had really taken place among them. So in the midst of all the possible details, what I keep coming back to is that last monologue of the man who has now regained his sight. The last speech he makes to the Pharisees right before they kick him to the curb. The man says, "Here's an astonishing thing. You do not know where this Jesus come from, and yet he opened my eyes. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." Astonishing. Never since the world began has it been heard. Those are some really big statements. The man who's been given sight sees the whole thing quite clearly indeed. Forget all the details. Everything in his life has changed due to him receiving his sight, and yet he knows this is much bigger than just him. He sees visually, and he can see that the rules have changed. Nothing is the same. God and Jesus just accomplished a big thing, an astonishing thing, something never done before. The world, as all the players in this scene have known, is no longer what it used to be. See, there are certain things a person should be able to take for granted. That people born blind stay blind. But if that's up for grabs now, well, if that's up for grabs, what else is up for grabs? I don't like to pick on the Pharisees too much. They were coming from a particular point of view, and they were being faithful to it. They loved and they followed the law of God. They helped their neighbors navigate their lives in relation to that holy law. Their Jewish identity was grounded in certain behaviors and their way of living. It was how they found meaning in relationship with God, with the world they lived in, and with the community of which they were a part. I think the Pharisees believed God could heal, but they didn't think God would break God's own law. So doing the work of healing on the Sabbath for them, well, immediately it was called into question. How could that be an act of God? Where is this Jesus from? What are his credentials? How did he do this? And so the how of the recovery of the sight became way more important than the astonishing fact that it happened at all. The man who received his sight never changed his story. He said, "This is what I know. Listen to me. I was blind and now I see. This is astonishing. It must be from God. When has this ever happened before?" I don't want to just boil this down to saying we all need to be more like the man born blind who received his sight from Jesus. It isn't that we need to be more like him. I think we are him. It's right there in how the man received his sight and how we receive the gift of baptism and the gift of faith. It's the beginning of the astonishing thing that God does. The man sitting there by the side of the road, begging as he does every day to survive. Jesus walks by. The man doesn't ask Jesus to heal him. Jesus sees him. Jesus put mud on his eyes and tells him to go wash. And the man who has nothing to lose but everything to gain gets up and washes. Trusting and hoping in what Jesus said, he goes and washes up. And as a result, he receives his sight. Now, the story doesn't say, but we could suppose that someone helped lead the man to the pool where he washed. Just as you and I were at some point taken by someone to the baptismal font. Washed and clean, given new sight, given eyes of faith, a new way of looking at the world differently, seeing the astonishing things that God is doing. And if we think of the wonder and awe of children and the way they see the world, well, it was like the man seeing for the first time. The world is one big, wide open space, and God is busy doing incredible things. But then I think we end up going in reverse. That keen eyesight dulls, we get stuck in our one spot on the side of the road. The world shrinks. It becomes the people and the places we know best, our comfort zone. Somewhere where we can, in a sense, know so well that we could get around in the dark, following the same path and avoid getting tripped up. We aren't just the blind man. No, we're the Pharisees too. Trying to be faithful, seeing the details, interpreting the world through a zoom lens. Not long ago, being sick was about the individual sick person. But now we see differently. We see it as it truly is, as it probably always was. That each person is part of the bigger whole, the community of the world. Martin Luther said, "We are all beggars as we come to the altar. We all have our hands out in need of God's grace, a free gift. Just like the man born blind who receives his sight from Jesus, a beggar who receives a free gift. It's a gift we can't ask for, but it isn't anything because it isn't anything within our small imagination. It's so big and wide open, this thing that God does for us. When has it ever been done that a sinner is made a saint? By the grace and love of God for the whole world, God comes to us in Jesus and makes us whole and then connects us forever to something that is bigger than ourselves. We are now and will always be in relationship with an astonishing God. And that is the story we tell over and over again. I was blind, but now I see. With the sight we receive from Jesus, we go from zooming in and focusing on the details to flipping around the binoculars and seeing the thing that we looked at so closely is just one thing in God's great big landscape. We see God not just being God for us, but God for the sake of the whole world. God's connected to it all, not just you or me. God's active and moving in relationship with the whole world, all people, all creation. Turning around those binoculars, we can see the long view of God. We see God in the whole world God loves, the whole world God redeems, the whole world God sent Jesus into. The man born blind sees that the sight he has been given is not only about him. God just got a whole lot bigger, a whole lot more astonishing. God's out of the box, and there's no way to contain God within the same old limitations again. It's no longer about how you or your or my God relates to the world, but it's about how the God of the whole world relates to you and me, and then how we all relate to one another. The measures that we take right now, they're not just for our individual health. They're for the health of everyone. And Jesus sticks with us. He doesn't just make us whole and give us this mind-blowing vision of things and then move on. He comes back to us again and again, just like Jesus sought out the man who received his sight after he heard he was kicked out of the synagogue, outcast from his community. Jesus comes and says, I am he. I'm the one you can believe in. You see me. I'm here with you. The brokenness of the world and our brokenness will threaten to blind us, but Jesus restores our eyes of faith over and over. And he does it for us, for our own sake, yes, of course, but he also does it for the sake of the whole world. So we can continue to then tell the astonishing story of a God who loves the world and each of us as part of the world. An astonishing story of staying home, of washing hands, of sewing face masks, of not buying more than we need, of remembering and looking out for the vulnerable. An astonishing story of how the blind see, how the broken is made whole, how the light shines in the darkness, and how the darkness does not overcome it. An astonishing story of beggars who receive the gift of grace. An astonishing story of how even the dead rise again. Amen.